3 Religion in Ancient Ugarit. Nicholas Wyatt. Introduction. There is a sense in which no religion dies, unless it be through the extermination of its believers and practitioners and the destruction of its sacred traditions. So long as there is any historical continuity, elements, however transformed in the transmission, will survive into the belief systems of the physical and cultural heirs of the community under examination. This is certainly the case with the religion of Ugarit, whose links with contiguous and subsequent cultures can be so well documented. Point 1. The city of Ugarit, rediscovered and excavated continuously from 1929 to the present day at the North Syrian coastal site of Tel Ras Shamra, 11 kilometers north of Latakia, map 3.1. has yielded more substantial written records than any other in the Levant throughout the ancient BCE period, and indeed more than all other sites in Syria, the Lebanon and Israel put together. While this archive is fairly restricted in scope, dating from the Late Bronze Age, from the late 14th to the first decade of the 12th century BCE, its religious contents in particular betray wide influences, and have significant links with later religious tradition, in Greece, the Levant and in particular Israel. The importance of this material is out of all proportion to its limited quantity, and if one archaeological site should be identified as the most significant for the early history of the entire region, including Israel, Ras Shamra has perhaps the best claim. It is on this basis that, in a volume which treats the ancient religions of the major cultures and empires of the ancient world, a chapter is devoted here apparently to the religious tradition of one single city. While small groups of scholars, mainly in Europe and North America, research in this area, and a larger number take its findings into account in biblical or classical research, it may be regarded so far as the general public is concerned as Near Eastern archaeology's best-kept secret. But Ugarit here represents the whole. Map 3.1. The Northern Levant. Levantine tradition, neither Egyptian, Anatolian nor Mesopotamian, one of the primary taproots of Western Asiatic and European culture, during the formative period of the 2nd millennium BCE. Description 2. The Tel, ancient city mound, made of the accumulated debris of some 5,000 years of occupation on the site, is approximately 20 hectares in area, though the entire city spilled over a larger area and was the metropolis of a small kingdom stretching at its greatest extent from Kosob, on the southern slopes of Jebel el-Akra, ancient Mount Saphan, in the north, by the mouth of the Orents, to or just beyond the Nahr al-Kabir in the south, a river some 4 kilometers south of Latakia, and eastwards to the Awalite range of mountains flanking the Orents Valley on the west, that is some 2,200 square kilometer. At its greatest extent it may have reached about 5,500 square kilometer. Neighboring kingdoms were at times linked to it by treaties. At least one dynastic marriage with the kingdom of Amuru, northern Lebanon, is attested, while Ugarit spent much of its documented historical period walking a diplomatic knife edge between the demands of Hatti, the Hittite Empire of Anatolia, the great power to the north, and Egypt to the south. Excavation and discoveries. The site was discovered by accident in 1928, when a local farmer struck a limestone slab with his plowshare. It was quickly identified as belonging to a chambered tomb of a type familiar in early Greece, suggesting a substantial settlement in the neighborhood. The first excavations revealed a port on the shore at Minay el-Baida, ancient Mahadu, and about 2 kilometers to the east, the ancient Tel of Ras Shamra was quickly identified as the site of Ugarit. Tablets were unearthed in the first season at Ras Shamra, in 1929. Texts in a number of languages and scripts were found. Thus a few fragments of Egyptian and hieroglyphic Hittite, the imperial language of Anatolia, were found, and some remains identified as Cypro-Minoan. The bulk of the texts were written in cuneiform writing, made by sharpened reeds impressed on damp clay, comprising Akkadian, Sumerian, languages of Mesopotamia, and Hittite written in syllabic script, and what turned out to be 2 further languages written in a script of only 30 signs, which was therefore essentially alphabetic in nature. With a rapid decipherment by C. Virolo and H. Bauer, these were shown to be. Map 3.2. Tel Ras Shamra and environs. Horan, already known from El Amarna in Egypt, neighboring Alalak and Nuzi in Mesopotamia, and a new language subsequently named Ugaritic. The bulk of the written remains from the site are in Akkadian and Ugaritic, with the latter language being most prominent in the religious sphere, internal administration, and royal and private correspondence. Nature of the site. The Tell of Ugarit, map 3.2, is roughly square in shape, and rises some 20 m above the surrounding terrain. Excavation thus far, in over 70 years, is still largely in the topmost, late Bronze Age, levels, though soundings have been made to deeper levels, including one important shaft which reveals settlement on the site going back to the 8th millennium BCE. The site was not resettled on any scale after its final destruction circa 1190 BCE, and so the entire Late Bronze city lies fairly close to the surface, where not already excavated. It consists of a well-planned, well-constructed city built almost entirely of stone. To the northeast, the high point of the Tell, the Acropolis, is the site of two temples of the Migdal, tower, type typical of the Levantine coast, built in massive masonry, with walls up to 3 m thick in parts. The northwesterly of the two is identified as that of Baal, Hadad, the ancient Amorite storm god, while some 50 m to its southeast stands a temple usually associated with Dagon, encountered as the Philistine god Dagon in the Bible. Both deities had a widespread cult over most of the Fertile Crescent. In the center of the city stood another temple, the so-called Rhyton Temple, which is perhaps to be regarded as that of El. This deity, again widely worshipped beyond Ugarit, was treated in Pantheon lists and mythology as the father of the gods, the creator, though no creation myth has so far been discovered. A further building identified tentatively as a royal chapel was found among the extensive constructions on the west of the Tell, almost a quarter of the entire area being taken up with a series of palaces and their administrative blocks, archives and storerooms. In addition, other sites may represent sanctuaries, and a number of allusions are made in the literary remains to further temples. 3. The considerable extent of the palaces reveals the fact that Ugarit was a capital city. Here was concentrated not only the civil and economic but also the military and priestly administration of the kingdom, with all the complex ritual practices which nurtured community life, supported the royal ideology and maintained the complex diplomatic relationships of a small kingdom. The king was the titular head of all these departments of state, and was particularly prominent in the ritual life of the kingdom, being represented in mythological texts as divine, an incarnation in the midst of his subjects. In all probability, the ideology we can reconstruct from Ugaritian evidence is probably fairly representative of kingship beliefs in the ancient Levant, and provides analogues to the system already familiar from the larger-scale Egyptian monarchy. The residential quarters of the city reveal a network of streets and alleyways, paved in stone and with understreet and house drainage systems which must have been an enormous boon in a hot climate, if well maintained. Houses comprised rooms surrounding central courtyards, with evidence of staircases showing that they were often of 2 or 3 stories in height. In most houses, one room was set aside for the family burial vault, which consisted of a mausoleum entered through a staircase going down beneath the floor, and giving onto one or more chambers. Thus the family dead continued their existence in close proximity to their descendants. Dependencies, Mahadu and Ras ibn Hani. Ugarit was at the center of a wide trading network. Some precious substances, such as amber and lapis lazuli, witnessed trading connections reaching, if only indirectly, as far as the Baltic and Afghanistan. As a major naval power, its cargo vessels went as far west as Crete, if not Greece, and plied the coast down to Egypt. As evidenced by the range of languages attested above, it was a cosmopolitan community, open to cultural, artistic and religious influences from a wide area. The port was at Mahadu, a substantial satellite development in the Bay of Minay el-Baida, while a little to the southwest, on the headland of Ras ibn Hani, the kings constructed summer palaces, called by onshore breezes, from which further texts have been recovered. A small urban development separated the two palaces. The archives. The archives have been found in widespread parts of the Tell, though naturally enough they were concentrated in particular areas, notably various places in the palace complex, in a house identified as the high priest's house near the Bull Temple, in other private residences belonging to important people, and most recently in the house of a high official named Aratu on the south side of the city. In the description below, I shall concentrate on religious texts. The vast bulk of the religious texts are in Ugaritic, with a smaller number in Horan, or bilingual, and just a few in Akkadian. Non-religious texts also provide a considerable amount of incidental information, e.g. in theophoric personal names for and the general structure of society, which fills out the picture of the religious documents. Languages and culture. The earliest levels at Res Shamra, from circa 6500 BCE, are pre-pottery Neolithic, and from then until the Middle Bronze, circa 2200 BCE, when there was a break in occupation, nothing can be said about the ethnic or cultural aspects of the site. But the king list, KTU 1.113 Reverend 5, may have listed up to 50 kings, which would take us back to this period in a tradition of a single dynastic line, though this was probably fictitious. Datanu, var. Didanu, who features in text KTU 1.124 as a minor underworld god, and in KTU 1.161, the royal funeral liturgy discussed below, as the eponym of the ancient Arpam, legendary kings antedating the historical king list, may be tentatively identified with an Amorite king from the Assyrian king list, while Keret, or Kotha, the hero, or antihero, of the story bearing his name, and apparently king of Kaba, has been tentatively identified with a king of Mitanni, in eastern Syria, of the same name. The neighboring kingdom of Amuru to the south was evidently Amorite 6 in cultural terms, and we know from one or two older documents that a king of Ugarit was in communication with Muri, whose last king, Zimralim, actually visited Ugarit in the 18th century BCE. There may have been a further break in settlement, or at least breakdown in central government, in the 15th century, immediately before the apogee of Ugaritian culture in the Late Bronze Age, when the state disengaged from Egyptian control and became a Hittite vassal state. The antecedents of the South Arabian alphabet were known in Ugarit, and the cuneiform alphabet itself may have been modeled on Egypto-Levantine alphabetic experiments. Some traditions, notably the Horan, southern Syria, geography of text KTU 1.108 and the Galilean geography some have discerned in the Akkad story 7 also point to wider engagement in the larger region of the Levant. As the polyglot nature of the archives indicates, 8 languages are attested. Ugarit as a commercial center was host to resident communities from Egypt, Cyprus, Hatti, Turkey, the neighboring kingdoms, Mitanni, eastern Syria, and probably further afield. Thus its lifestyle and the range of cultural contacts, interactions and influences were thoroughly cosmopolitan. Religion at Ugarit. The religious texts written in Ugaritic constitute the most important evidence for the reconstruction of Ugaritian religion. In view of the paucity of later, first millennium, textual survivals, they also provide our most important single source of information for the Levant throughout the rest of the ancient period, BCE, though here only cautious inferences may be drawn, since the evidence is no longer direct. The religion of the city undoubtedly represents the broad nature of the national religion, though the surviving textual information, by its nature as royal and priestly archive material, undoubtedly highlights official religion at the expense of popular and private forms. It may be treated systematically, as is done below. There is always a danger, of course, that an analytical treatment will distort the historical reality. It may, for instance, err in identifying different literary genres which the ancients may not have distinguished. Or it may, as has undoubtedly happened in the period before detailed examination of the ritual texts was undertaken, lead to misreading or overreading of the data to be gleaned from the earlier material, in particular the mythological texts. Thus by the incautious use of data from Eusebius, writing in the 4th century CE, who quotes older writers, and comparison with Greek and Hittite material, the erroneous conclusion was drawn that El was deposed by a younger generation of gods. This is now known to be false. Early interpretations, in the fashion of the time, also fairly consistently interpreted Canaanite religion, a biblical category, within which Ugarit religion was automatically included, as a fertility cult, and explained the myths concerning Baal as allegories of the seasons. In addition, biblical estimates of Canaanite religion as an abomination have persistently colored some interpretations. 8. So long as we remain alert to the dangers of misrepresentation and simplistic reductionism, however, and recognize that each step in the recovery of information from scraps of surviving information is only provisional, a balanced view is possible. Cosmology. We may begin with a general consideration of cosmology, that is, the imagined structure of the world, as represented in the minds of the theologians of the culture. These would have been the poets who not only preserved ancient beliefs, but consciously or otherwise continually adapted them to changing circumstances, since no theology is immutable. No formal statement of cosmological beliefs survives, but the following picture may be reconstructed from incidental allusions. The cosmic center was Mount Saphan. It is clear from geographical lists and other allusions that this essentially mythical mountain was identified with Jebel el-Akra, the 2000 massif some 40 kilometers north of Ugarit. It was associated above all in the myths of Baal as the throne of this god. 9 An analysis of the texts shows that it was in fact the seat of El himself, head of the Pantheon, which was delegated to the sea god Yam, won in battle by Baal, and then used for his enthronement by Athor. Thus a number of individual deities were explicitly associated with it, and were theologically linked by this process, and the canonical Pantheon list KTU 1.47 identified all the representative deities of the list as gods of Saphan. The mountain lies on the northern horizon when viewed from Ugarit, and evidently formed the focal point of the community's theology, which like all ancient theologies was associated with geographical features, thus sacralizing the national territory. While specific details are fragmentary, we can with some assistance from the biblical worldview, 10 which shares many features, reconstruct the fuller ideal landscape. From the sacred mountain at the center stretched out a zone of productive farmland, giving eventually onto the steppe. This in turn merged into desert, and was bounded by the cosmic sea. This ideal world was probably superimposed upon real geography in the practice of the cult, thus validating the real world of experience by its assimilation to the ideal world. This is particularly evident in the rituals surrounding the birth, accession and death of kings, which were couched in the language of the national myths. An interesting instance of this process of superimposition may be seen in the text KTU 1.23, The Gracious Gods, which combines mythical and ritual elements. The former, in the form of a narrative of divine conception and birth, is located at the end of the world, on the shore of the cosmic ocean. But it is related by means of rubrics and hymnic episodes to a ritual taking place in the city, probably in a shrine in the palace. The Pantheon lists. Considerable numbers of divine names appear in the Ugaritic texts, in one estimate over 200. While some of these were epithets, over 20 belong to Baal alone, and others are disputed, new ones are continually coming to light, so that the number is gradually increasing. Most pantheons, in the general sense, are ad hoc agglomerations, in that they reflect the unplanned developments of history, migrations here, the growth or shrinkage of empire there. Many of the deities are familiar from other regions of the Fertile Crescent, some were imports from Mesopotamia 11 or even Egypt 12, while other native figures in turn migrated to these other regions. 13 At the same time, pantheons in a more restricted sense, of organized lists, reflect processes of systematic theological thinking, though it is of course extremely difficult to discern the motives of the priests compiling them. 3 examples of one pantheon list point to the existence of a canonical pantheon. See Table 3.1, a proposal supported by the use of the list in a composite ritual text. A synoptic text is given here in tabular form, which illustrates the theoretical thinking, if so systematic a term is appropriate, lying behind the Table 3.1. The Canonical Pantheon at Ugarit, a synoptic version of texts KTU 1.47 and KTU 1.118, Ugaritic, and RS 20.24, Akkadian. 1. The deities of Saphun. The god of the ancestor. L. See text. Dagon. See text. 2. Ball of Saphun. See text. Ball. 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 The personified clouds. Ball. 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 3. Earth and heaven. Kotharat. See text. Yari. Moon god. Saphun. The sacred mountain. Kotha. See text. Pidre. See text. After. See text. 4. Mountains and valleys. Athirat. See text. Anot. See text. Shapsh. Sun goddess. Asi. An underworld goddess. Ishara. A Hurrian goddess. Aftart. See text. 5. The gods who help Baal. Resheph. Plague god. Dadmish. Earth god. 6. The assembly of the gods. Yam. Sea god. Censor. Kinnar. Lyre god. 7. Kings. Shalem. See text. List. This list bears the heading The Deities of Saphun on one of the tablets. As shown in Table 3.1, the text falls into 7 natural parts, each with a representative deity, followed by further exemplars of the type. 3 sets, numbers 2 to 4, each comprise 7 members, and Saphun, the mountain at the center of the universe, appears as the 4th, that is, central, member of the central set of 3. This group may therefore represent an earlier form of this pantheon list, in which 21 deities, 3 sets of 7, represented the totality of all divine powers, with their geographical symbol, the sacred mountain, as their central figure. This hypothetical earlier pantheon would correspond to the 3 realms of Greek cosmology ruled over by Zeus, sky, Poseidon, sea, and Hades, earth. The enlargement to 7 sets gives a list of 33:14 which is modified in its application in the ritual text KTU 1.148-30. This in turn suggests that the ritual use of a lunar calendar, 29 is too few, may lie behind the enlargement. Certainly, a lunar calendar appears to determine some features of the regular cult, in which new moons, full moons and sets of 7 days are particularly important. Further groups of ritual texts betray other routine orders, evidently representing various subgroups or alternative pantheons of significance for given ritual occasions. Such structures show the essentially symbolic nature of such groupings, which reflect a variety of theological purposes. With regard to the canonical lists, but similarly with other lists, their theoretical structure is also indicated by the fact that some members are not individual deities at all, but entire classes, mountains and valleys, the gods who help Baal, the assembly of the gods, and therefore already theoretical constructions, while the significance of others, and their seeming priority over important gods not appearing, simply escapes us. In addition, while all the main deities attested in the surviving mythological corpus are present, with the striking exception of Mot, see below, several of those featuring prominently in the ritual corpus are not. Furthermore, while all the members of the Ugaritic pantheon listed are evidently identified with Akkadian divine names in the parallel Akkadian text, they represent a specifically Ugaritian list, as distinct from independent Akkadian deities, such as Marduk and Enlil, occurring sporadically in syllabic documents, and therefore familiar to local priests, if not worshipped locally, as well as listed in other Akkadian pantheon lists, and independent Hurrian pantheons given in yet other lists. There is evidently systematic thought in these compositions, but the details remain elusive. Individual deities. Relatively few deities feature in the mythological texts. This does not necessarily mean that they are the most important, though their relative importance is perhaps indicated by their incidence in other West Semitic contexts, among which the Hebrew Bible constitutes a significant body of evidence from the first millennium, as well as other contexts, such as Egypt during the Hyksos period and afterwards. The briefest details are given here of only a few, on account of space limitations. I give the familiar forms, usually those found in the Bible, together with vocalized Ugaritic forms. To avoid confusion in matters of precedence, they are listed alphabetically. Anat, Aratu. Goddess of war and hunting. She bears the title Batulatu, virgin. Of contradictory nature, she is at once tender and erotic in her relation with Baal, who is not formally her consort, and savage and ruthless with the hero Akat, who rejects her request for his bow, and is murdered for his pains. Ns.15 in some texts she works. Ains.15 in some texts she works in tandem with Astarte, Greek Astarte, and the two goddesses fuse in the first millennium into Atagatis, Lucian of Samosata's famous Syrian goddess. Her martial role, glorying in slaughter, can be seen from this excerpt from the Baal cycle of myths. And lo! Anat fought in the valley. She battled between the two towns. She smote the people of the seashore. She destroyed the men of the sunrise. Beneath her like balls were he, DS. Above her like locusts were palms. Like grasshoppers heaps of palms of warriors. She fixed heads to her back. She attached palms to her girdle. Her knees she steeped in the blood of soldiers. Her thighs in the gore of warriors. With shafts she drove out the old men. With the string of her bow the townsfolk. 16. She also claims to have killed the primeval monsters associated with Yam, QV. The view that Anat was also a fertility goddess, or goddess of love, is not substantiated by the texts, despite her erotic encounters with Baal. These labels are used altogether too freely and uncritically with West Semitic deities. Athirat, Aratu. She appears to be the consort of El, though this is not stated explicitly. She is called the mother of the gods, who are in turn called the 70 sons of Athirat. Her commonest title, Rbtrt may mean either the great lady who tramples, or walks on, sea, or the great lady who bestrides, or measures, the day. The first sense would suggest that like Anat she overcomes maritime monsters, while the latter would confirm the view that she is a sun goddess. The element Rabitu, great lady, in the title cited also points to her importance in royal ideology, as will be seen below. Her cult appears to have survived for some centuries in Israel, according to recent estimates of the biblical evidence. Ataru. The masculine counterpart to Astarte, following, and, like her, probably an aspect of the planet Venus. 17. See also Shahar and Shalom. He appears in the Baal cycle of myths, complaining initially in a fragmentary text at being passed over for the kingship of the gods, but is later selected by his mother Athirat to be enthroned on Baal's throne following the latter's death. He appears to be a mythic type of the king, though the royal ideology of Ugarit also draws on Baalic imagery. After or his avatars Shahar and Shalom live on in Israelite tradition. The former is the subject of the taunt songs of Isaiah 14, bright one of the dawn, Latin Lucifer, while the latter is the ancient patron deity of Jerusalem, Akkadian form Jerusalem, city of Shalom. Astarte, Tatu. She is not prominent in the myths, where she appears only alongside Anat except for a brief episode 18 in which Baal sees her out hunting and tries in vain to seduce her. A fragmentary Egyptian myth, however, known as Astarte and the Tribute of the Sea is undoubtedly of West Semitic origin, and hints at a now-lost myth in which Astarte, who is demanded in tribute, may have vanquished the sea, compared to Anat above. Point 19 Egyptian evidence confirms the impression from the limited Ugaritic evidence that she was also a goddess of war and hunting, and with no basis in Ugaritian tradition for her later reputation for lasciviousness. An example of her appearance in a ritual text is the following. When Astarte of the window enters the pit in the royal palace, pour a libation into the pit of the chapel of the star gods. Point 20. This evokes a cultic procession, in which the goddess, i.e. her image, was brought, no doubt accompanied by incense and hymns, into a ritual area. It confirms her character as a royal goddess. Such a reference to a cult image, of which there are many similar in the ritual texts, demonstrates the ancient view that in some manner the deity was identified with the image. This is not to say that the deity's reality was limited to the image, since it could obviously inhabit other images too. But the kind of distinction modern commentators make between deity and image with regard to ancient religions is palpably not one the ancients would have recognized. Baal, Baalu, Baalu. The storm god, whose title means lord or master, is also called Hadu, thunderer, and is evidently a local form of the storm god found as Adad in Mesopotamia, Tube in Anatolia, Kumarbi in Mitanni and Hadad in 1st millennium Syria. Though all these gods were often regarded as distinct, they were frequently explicitly identified in texts, and shared common features in theology, iconography and mythology. Baal is lord of Saphan, the sacred mountain 40 kilometers north of the city, and appears in a number of hypostases. Note the 6 additional Baals in Table 3.1. He is the patron deity of Ugarit, Blugrt, Lord of Ugarit, and of its dynasty. As the chief character in the Baal cycle of myths, he overcomes Yam and is enthroned as king among the gods, and has a great palace, i.e. his temple at Ugarit, built. But challenged by Amoti, god of death, he dies, though he is later resuscitated and confirmed in his royal status. This extensive mythic complex, whose antecedents have now been traced into the 3rd millennium BCE, was at first widely interpreted in a seasonal fashion, as an allegory of the climatic and agricultural cycles of the year. It is better seen, however, as serving two purposes: first as the cult legend of the Baal temple, narrating its mythic origins, and second as a vehicle for royal ideology, celebrating Baal's patronage of the dynasty and the claims of the poet Ilimilku's patron Nikmadu III. Circa 1200 BCE. Thus the narrative of Baal's palace construction may also have symbolized the Ugaritian dynastic house, compared to the similar play of temple and dynasty in the Bible, in 2 Samuel 7:1-17. Other myths involving Baal are one in which he fathers a son on Anat, 21, another in which he and Anat make love, 22, and the one noted above, where he attempts a seduction of Astarte. In these myths his virility is paramount, so that he is in a sense a fertility god, the author of all fecundity. In one damaged text 23, however, he encounters two mysterious beings in the desert, and dies. In this narrative it appears that his death has an atoning function for the city. In a hymn to Baal 24 his help is invoked in time of military threat to the city. An example of apparent henotheism is a hymnic excerpt cited twice in the Baal myths. Our king is valiant. Baal is our ruler. And there is none above him. We should all bring his chalice. We should all bring his cup. 25. It should be recognized, however, that this monarchy is devolved, held by authority of the supreme god El Dagan, Darganu. This elusive deity, whose cult center was Tuttle on the upper Euphrates, appears sporadically in Ugaritian tradition, apparently as the father of Baal, who is called Bndgn, son of Dagan. The southeasterly of the two Acropolitan temples is usually associated with him, though scant evidence for his cult survives. Two stelae apparently invoke him as an underworld deity, perhaps receiving sacrifices on behalf of the dead, if this is what the term pagru meant. Some scholars think that he was identified with El, but there is no clear evidence for this. An Akkadian text from Babylon identifies him as Enlil, the Sumerian storm god. Ilu. The word Ilu appears in Akkadian, South Arabian and all the Northwest Semitic languages. It is the oldest term for god, and as an individual deity probably denotes an ancient moon god. In Ugarit he is called creator of creatures, and father of man, i.e. the king as a primal man figure, 26 and despite early attempts to see him as demoted, he is firmly in command of the Pantheon, the highest divine authority. He alone can heal a dying king in the Keret story, or can procure an heir for a childless king, in the Keret and Akhat stories, and he has an intimate relationship with kings, who are his sons. To be sure, since Ugarit was a royal city, and much of its literature was either ideological compositions by the priest and poet Ilimilku or ritual texts dealing explicitly with the king's involvement in the cult, such an emphasis should occasion no surprise. El may conceivably have been more remote in popular religion, though the incidence of his name in theophoric names suggests a great tradition of devotion here too. In the Baal cycle of myths, it is El's throne that features throughout as the focus of attention. Successively, Yam, Baal and After are enthroned upon it, wielding devolved power. While vigorous action goes on all around him, El sits enthroned and unmoving at the center of the universe, and to consult him and receive authority, deities travel towards El at the source of the rivers, amidst the springs of the two deeps. 27. Here they bow down before him, and he sits, benign and indulgent, and authorizes their every action, such as sanctioning a temple for Baal, or allowing a not to indulge her punishment for murder. El is the chief actor in two further myths. In one he begets the gods Shahar and Shalom, the morning and evening stars as royal gods, on the goddesses Athirat and Rame, who are the twin hypostases of Shapsh, the sun goddess. These goddesses are also his daughters, suggesting an older myth of the androgynous creator deity attested in India and Egypt. In another text, an applied myth, the purpose of which is to provide a prescription to cure hangover, El holds a feast in his Marzihu, the prototype of a social and religious institution widely attested in the Mediterranean world, where he becomes gloriously drunk, and is carried home by a Not and Aftart, who fetch medicine for him. El features prominently in biblical tradition, sometimes with epithets, El Shaddai, El Elyon, etc. He is usually identified explicitly or implicitly with Yahweh, though the book of Hosea tells a different story, regarding the false calves of northern worship as El 28. Horan, Aratu. This god does not have an active role in the mythical texts. He appears in a curse formula occurring in literary texts. The formula, adapted to each context, reads: May Horan smash. May Horan smash your head. Aftart the name of Baal your skull. He appears to be an underworld deity, perhaps his name means the one of the pit, i.e. the underworld, suitable to be invoked in curses, but also powerful to intercede in dangerous circumstances. In two snakebite texts either alone or with other deities he heals from snake venom, while in an exorcism ritual he is invoked to heal the victim. In the latter he appears to be the lord of demons. Such contingencies as these texts reflect, common enough in the ordinary life of the people, suggest that he was widely worshipped, and also explain his invisibility in centralized ritual practice and absence from the Pantheon lists. It is perhaps of some note that he is also absent from royal funerary texts, e.g. KTU 1.39, Del Olmo 1999, 213-17, where his underworld aspects might be considered important. He appears to belong to a popular level of religious practice, while most of our evidence is of their official state religion. Kotha, Ka. Eru. Kotha constructs cultic furniture, a palace for Baal, and a bow for Akhat in Ugaritic literature. As the apotheosis of all technologies, and thus in control of the most pervasive features of culture, he well illustrates the tendency of polytheism to reify in divine personae every aspect of life that is significant, in his case all technological aspects of life. Kotha is evidently a localized form of the Egyptian god Ptah, and is said in the tradition to come from Crete and Memphis. Pata appears with the epithet QSR equals Ugaritic K. Skillful. In the Akkadian Pantheon lists, Kotha is represented by Ea, in Sumerian Enki, the Mesopotamian god of wisdom, but the Egyptian influence appears to be predominant here. Kotharat, Kotatu, plural. Similarly, these goddesses, probably 7 in number, who are not directly related to Kotha, are concerned with weddings, pregnancy and childbirth, thus having the oversight of the continuity of the generations. They assist at the birth and infancy of Akhat, and a hymn to the Kotharat is presumably written after a sacred marriage text on the assumption that they are understood to be present at the nuptials of Yari and Nitkal. 29. Motu. The only recognizable god from Ugarit who is consistently absent from all the cultic material, and the recipient of no offerings in texts discovered so far, Mot is the personification of death. He is, as it were, a theologian's god, rather than the object of worship. He appears from descriptions to be not only the idea of death, but also the personification of the underworld as a devouring mouth into which all go. He extends a lip to the Ea, Arti, a lip to the heavens. He extends a tongue to the stars. 30. Since the gods are stars, the third line of this tricolon implies that the gods too are threatened by Mot. Thus Baal's ultimate victory over Mot, aided by the goddess Shapsh, herself, like Anot and Athirat, a destroyer of monsters, is evidently an affirmation of the values of life and renewal against the threat of annihilation. Pidrayu. Appearing only fleetingly in the myths as a daughter and consort of Baal, she is probably to be linked to the Greek characters Phaedra or Pandora, the latter like Pidre an underworld goddess. She appears frequently in sacrificial texts, however, and appears to belong to a group of royal deities invoked on behalf of the monarchy. Ramayu. She appears as twin of Athirat in the myth of the gracious gods, the two goddesses being geminated hypostases of Shapsh. Her name, meaning uterine, is probably to be restored in the following passage, where we read of Yasib, Keret's son, to be born of the new queen Huri, that he will drink the milk of a thigh, rat. He will drain the breast of virgin, Rame. The suckling of goddesses. 31. She thus appears to have considerable significance in the royal ideology of Ugarit. Rapio. Absent from the myths, Rapio is the subject of a liturgical prayer which invokes his protection of the city. He has been identified with various other gods, e.g. Baal or El, but is rather to be seen as the patron of the Arpum, who are the heroes of the past, legendary kings of yore, and protectors of Ugarit. The Arpum themselves feature in 3 very fragmentary texts, evidently arriving by chariot for a funerary feast, and are summoned along with more recent dead kings to welcome Nikmadu III into the underworld on the occasion of his funeral. 32. An intriguing element of continuity of tradition is found in a hymn to Rapu, where he is said to be the god enthroned in Aphtarat, the god who rules in Edrei. 33. The same cities are said in the Bible to be the abode of Og king of Bashan in Deuteronomy 1:4, dwelt Maimene was enthroned in, and he is identified as the last of the Rephaim, Hebrew Rapio with macronym equals Ugaritic Arpum, in Deuteronomy 3:11, while Deuteronomy 3:13b is a note identifying Og's kingdom as the country of the Rephaim. The Hebrew Rapio with macronym may mean the underworld of the Rephaim. Reshef, Rapu. As his name, pestilence, indicates, Reshef is the apotheosis of disease, an example of an evil god who is invoked as the most powerful antidote to illness. Widely worshipped throughout the Levant, and even in Egypt, he is probably the prototype of the Greek god Apollo. He contrasts with Horan, above, in being of a similar underworld nature, and yet very prominent in the temple rituals. This may be explained by Reshef's involvement in, and Horan's absence from, the small circle of gods who are evidently the patrons of the dynasty, and thus royal gods. 30 For this representative role played by Reshef may also account for the absence of Mot from the cult. Identified in the Akkadian Pantheon lists with Nergal, the Mesopotamian god of the underworld, he appears to preempt Mot's obvious equivalence with Nergal. Shahar, Aharu, and Shalom, Alamu, as twin gods of the planet Venus, are further royal gods from Ugarit, and according to some a twinned form of the god After. As markers of dawn and dusk, they represent the temporal construction of the day. As a pair, they symbolize the dual nature of kingship, which is prominent in Egyptian thought, but also, on a different mythological basis more akin to the present tradition, persists into the theory of monarchy in medieval Europe. Shapsh, Apu. The sun is connected with royalty throughout the ancient Near East. In the Semitic world it is originally deified as a goddess. Thus in the West Semitic world the solar deity is the mythical mother of the king. She shares the title RBT, Rabatu, Great Lady, with Afirat. As the source of all light, the solar deity becomes a representation of wisdom, law and justice. Ruling the day, she also conquers nocturnal monsters during her nightly passage through the underworld. This explains her importance in the liturgy for the funeral of King Nikmadu III. In the gracious gods Afirat and Rame are her avatars. Yam, Yamu, Yamu. He is most visible as the opponent of Baal. He is initially made king of the gods by El and placed on his, El's, own throne, before Baal wrests power from him in single combat. Though scholars are generally agreed that we have no specific creation myth from Ugarit, we should probably discern in this cycle of delegated kingship, first Yam, then Baal, a narrative account of world development, in which Yam represents the primeval order and the old gods, compared to the Asuras of India, the Titans of Greece and the Ogdode of Hermopolis in Egypt, who play their part in origins before ceding place to the gods of the existential world. Yam is certainly not to be understood, as some have proposed, as the personification of evil. He is perhaps to be identified with Litan, LTN, prototype of the biblical Leviathan and Greek Ladin, who encircles the world as the cosmic ocean. See the expression Litan, the wriggling serpent, the writhing serpent. Encircler with 7 heads, a passage echoed in Isaiah 27:1. As a serpent and the apotheosis of the sea, he embodies the ambiguity of the ocean, the vehicle of much of the economic life of a maritime power, yet fraught with danger, and the ultimate symbol of transformation and renewal. Yari, Yari? The moon god is apparently quite distinct from El, who formerly may have had, but later lost this function. Apart from being the groom in the marriage myth of Nitkal, he is not conspicuous among the deities. Yet Ugarit clearly followed a cultic calendar linked to the lunar month, with its great emphasis on new moons, full moons and 7-day periods, so we may suppose that as a controller of time, compared to Thoth in Egypt and Sin in Mesopotamia, he was a god of the first importance in ritual. It is evident from this brief discussion that there is a certain division of labor among the deities. They are in effect the apotheosis of various cosmological, environmental or cultural realities which impinge directly on the life of the community. In view of the paucity of the evidence, it is well to avoid too great an assumption of restrictive specialization. Those deities of whom we know most, notably Baal and El, tend to universal qualities. Strict specialization belongs to an early phase in theological development, for increasing symbolic associations and a natural inflation in the language of praise tend always to expansion of conception. Estimates that episodes such as El's inebriation, together with all the sex and violence of other texts, betray the moral bankruptcy of Ugaritian religion are superficial. 35. While still imperfectly understood, the Pantheon of Ugarit is sufficiently documented for us to discern a vigorous and effective theological dimension, in which the natural antagonisms and tensions of social and moral life are given expression in myth, and the theology of the Pantheon resolves disruptive aspects, reinforcing social values and structures. It is in the nature of evidence from a royal city that the greatest emphasis should be on the role of the king in social and political management. Through the various deities discussed, and the ritual life to be outlined below, the identity, territorial claims and general life of the community were affirmed and sacralized. Public, state, religion. The aspects of religion dealt with here were public in the sense that they were practiced on behalf of the nation, but performed in temple or palace precincts. They were probably not accessible to public view, except when processions traversed the city. The vast bulk of our information about the performance of regular religious practice comes from archives written in Ugaritic and Horan. Of this material, most was found in the so-called house of the high priest, between the two Acropolitan temples, and the rest in the palace. The so-called house of the diviner yielded a number of model livers and a lung, see below, on which were inscribed readings of various natural or pathological markings on the surface of the organs, interpreted as arcane messages from the gods warning of future events. Various oracular techniques of this kind would be pursued in both public and private contexts. Royal involvement in the cultus. Royal involvement is amply attested. Rituals were performed both in the various temples around the city and in different parts of the palace, and no doubt in domestic contexts, which would include funeral rites for private citizens. In addition, there are allusions in the texts to ritual processions, or to the gods traveling, which refer to images carried in procession, and these probably traveled around the city and to sacred places outside. Many of the texts involve the king as chief officiant, while others are specifically intended to emphasize, reinforce and declare his status as himself one among the gods. We shall deal with ritual in more general terms below. Here our concern is to indicate the king's role. The following example illustrates both his more general priestly function and his more specific ideological role. While its status as a formal New Year ritual text is open to debate, one important text 36 is obviously of considerable significance in the ritual calendar. The location of the rites is not specified in detail, but appears to have been peripatetic or in different locations on different days of the festival, since it mentions the Chapel Royal in line 20, the Sanctuary of the Mistress of the Great Temples in lines 26 and 37, a spring in line 33, the Sanctuary of El in line 38, and the Altar of Baal in line 41. While in lines 54 to 5 the king is returned to his palace. It deals with a series of rites performed through the month of first of the wine. The beginning of the month, indicated by the appearance of the new moon, is celebrated with the offering of a bunch of grapes as a communion sacrifice to El, line 2.37. Then in preparation for the climax of the festival on the 14th day, the full moon, the king is to wash himself thoroughly on the 13th, that is, for the purification to take effect. Before the 14th, line 3. On the 14th, we read that the king sits, i.e. is formally enthroned, being purified, and shall clap his hands and proclaim the day. Subsequently he is to enter the temple, lines 6 to 8. Evidently the royal behavior symbolizes the way in which the king links the human and divine worlds by his effective actions. It is in this context that his divine nature, to be noted below, is actualized and made effective. In the temple he makes offering to the deities, pours libations, and takes offerings of myrrh oil, spiced oil, honey and pigeons to the royal chapel. Subsequently he makes offerings into the hole, which is probably to be construed as a pit symbolizing the entrance to the underworld. This suggests, though this text does not state it, some form of communion with the spirits of dead kings, if situated in the palace. This may be the pit envisaged in, and perhaps the location of the offerings in various other texts. The expression in Ilm in the text is construed by Del Olmo as the divine people, whom he regards as the divinized ancestors of the dynasty. 38. These ancestors feature prominently in other aspects of the cult, as will be seen. Among the offerings are 14 pitchers of wine, line 22, no doubt intended to represent the 14 days since the new moon. The structure of text KTU 1.41 is uncertain. But after the detailed treatment of day 14, it reverts to the 3 days ending the first lunar quarter, i.e. days 5 to 7 and finally day 1, new moon. Here are detailed a further complex of ritual acts by the king, some of which at least have, it seems, specifically to deal with royal ideology, and the text ends with the formal desacralization of the king, thus freeing him for secular duties. These additional elements are the Kubadu offering, line 39, and the use of 8 dwellings constructed on the palace roof, line 51. The latter may correspond to the Sukkot, booths or tabernacles, constructed in the Israelite Feast of Tabernacles, Leviticus 23:33-6, 39-43, but also to the Mesopotamian Akitu shrine, in which the king performed the sacred marriage. The former we shall treat below, along with royal funerals and their subsequent elements of cult. Royal ideology. We have seen the primary importance of the king in the palace rituals. In a sense, of course, the king is ex officio the focus of attention on the human side of the cultic program, the gods being the recipients of cult mediated through him. But his role was far more than incidental. It is as though his formal status was expressed in terms appropriate to the seriousness of his office. The Ugaritic king list evidently formed some kind of official list. It is uncertain whether the kings were all regarded as sons of their predecessors, 40. Though we know this to have been the case with those of the final documented period. On the basis of other ancient Near Eastern king lists, which were ideological in purpose, we may suppose that a deliberate choice has been made, wicked kings having been perhaps weeded out, so that the present series, however factual or fictitious, represents a canonical list. Respect for the past and continuity with that past, and even the construction of the past, the hallmarks of all religious tradition, are self-evident in such a composition. Two features of the text 41 are significant. First, the obverse of the tablet contains a liturgical text. Though it is too fragmentary to be interpreted with certainty, it may be the remains of a litany to be addressed to the listed kings as part of a Kispam rite 42, the purpose of which was to affirm social solidarity with the ancestors, and to invoke their assistance in the maintenance of cosmic order. This suggests that dead kings were understood to maintain a benevolent involvement in the continuing life of the community. Furthermore, each royal name in the list is prefixed with the generic term Illinois, Ilu, God, or divine. This may have been no more than a polite cliché, meaning dead. In view of the other evidence to be cited, however, it seems more likely that it has some theological content. If Del Olmo's interpretation of the Inilm is correct, the divine people, then the expression occurring in various ritual texts may be a shorthand reference to the membership of the king list, invoked and given offerings as a group. Another important royal text 43 has also been interpreted as consisting partly of a Kispam rite. What is clear is that as a whole it formed the liturgy for the funeral of Ugarit's penultimate king, Nikmadi III. This text begins with the summoning of a number of figures, only the final two being among the names from the king list. You are invoked, O saviors of the under-world. You are summoned, assembly of Di, Dan. Invoked is Ulkan the Saviour. Invoked is Taraman the Saviour. Invoked is Sidan and Raiden. Invoked is the Eternal One, Ba. They have been invoked, the ancient saviors. You are invoked, O saviors of the underworld. You are summoned, O assembly of Daidan. Invoked is Amithtamtru the king. And, invoked as well as Nikmadu 44 the king. The first 9 lines here are devoted to persons not appearing in the king list. The figures cited here are called Arpam, which may be translated as saviors, healers or perhaps heroes. While their status is much debated, the majority view is that they were illustrious dead kings from the remote past, perhaps more legendary than historical, comparable, as minor gods, to the Greek heroes. Keret and Daniel 45 may both be among their number. The saviors may, as noted above, be associated with a patron deity Rapio, Rapu, Sing of Arpam. While there is no direct evidence that they were recipients of cult, unless the term in Ilm embraced them too, 3 fragmentary texts appear to envisage them arriving at feasts in horse-drawn chariots, which may be a mythological or liturgical expression for just such participation. At any rate, the Arpam appear to link deceased kings to the Pantheon in some indeterminate way. The god Rapio himself is the subject of a hymn, noted above, addressed to this patron of deified kings, or a collective into which they all enter, on the occasion of a king's descent into the underworld to join his ancestors. There is also evidence from the Keret story which has a direct bearing on the status of the living king. While as king of Kaba he may not represent the same royal ideology, the probability is that his story is meant precisely to express a number of aspects of Ugaritian royal ideology. I have argued that the story has been pressed into service by Ilimilku, the royal scribe, in order to bolster the claim to the throne of Nikmadu III. Keret is said to be Bien Illinois, son of God, which could mean one of two things, or both. That once a Bien Illinois was a member of the genus God, so that it is tantamount to saying that Keret is divine. At the same time, in mythological usage, it meant son of El, as though it was the high god who was directly involved in the paternity of the king, rather as in Egypt. This more powerful sense is supported by the fact that El in turn is referred to as Abadm, Father of man, where the man is the primal man, or Adam figure, incarnate in the king himself. Echoes of such language can be discerned in Psalms 2, 8, 19 and 110 and elsewhere in the Bible, suggesting that both cultures, Ugarit and Israelite, are attesting a similar royal ideology. Further elements common to the two ideologies will be seen below. The same familial language implying a divine status is to be discerned in the allusions cited above to Yasib, Keret's son, as being suckled by goddesses. All in all, there is evidently a considerable body of circumstantial evidence for regarding the king as in some way divine. Is it possible to elaborate on this? The king was obviously a fully human person in so far as he lived and died like a man, begot sons, fought, might be deposed and so forth. Furthermore, in the palace rituals, he performed the role of chief priest. But it is precisely here that, as we have noted, he acted as intermediary between the divine and human realms. We may go further, and say that the language deliberately used of him indicates that he was somehow supposed to participate in both realms, and in both orders of being. He was thus both human and divine. It is perhaps important also to distinguish between the temple cults performed regularly with or without the king's presence, and those performed in the palace complex. If the latter had any distinct rationale, as distinct from a mere domestic duplication of the temple rituals, it was surely to sacralize and confirm the reality of the monarchical order, represented by the king. When he took part in a procession of divine images, it is as though he himself was regarded as one of them, and indeed, if the analogy of Egyptian cult is valid, the cult offered to images was precisely modeled on that offered to the king. Thus their efficacy and importance was as much validated by association with the king, as was his by association with them. We may even postulate that the ritual purification of the king at the beginning of ceremonies, and his desacralization at the end, which are repeatedly prescribed in the ritual texts, were formal ritual means of imposing on him divine and human status respectively. He would thus be a god only during the performance of the royal cultus. This is further reinforced when we consider the deliberate linking of the king to the mythological order, as will be seen in the next feature. In dealing with the ritual of the month of first of the wine above, we noted the possible allusion to a Kubadu rite, line 39. This brings us to another interesting aspect of royal ideology, where evidence from various quarters allows the tentative reconstruction of a feature of Ugaritian theory and practice. The Kubadu rite was first identified at Irma on the Euphrates. It appears there in a number of contexts in the Nin. Lady of the God, installation rites of the high priestess of the storm god. It consisted there of the ritual processing of an axe, and possibly of other weapons. Perhaps to be related to this rite was an analogous one from Muri, further down the Euphrates. This was alluded to in an oracle delivered to King Zimrilim, ironically the last king of the city, 46. Thus speaks Adad. I have brought you back to the throne of your father, and have given you the arms with which I fought against Tiamat. I have anointed you with the oil of my victory, and no one has withstood you. This short text is profoundly important, as the key to a great mythic and ritual nexus pervading Near Eastern culture, as we shall see below. In the present context, the significant feature is its use of weapons in the cult. Now a further ritual composition from Ugarit, while not explicitly identifiable as a Kubadu rite text, may be alluding to the symbolism behind it. This passage invokes the gods to protect Ugarit, and bases its confidence in their goodwill by an appeal to sacred weapons. By the divine spear. By the divine axe. By the divine mace. By the divine Dian weapon. 47. Since the ritual texts operated within a context where the presuppositions of this material were simply taken for granted, we should not expect any explanation, and the absence of the term kubadu, cn. 40, from the context is not crucial one way or another in interpreting it. We shall see in a mythological context that it was given a far clearer expression, though again without formal explanation. In view of the storm god being the focus of the ritual in Irma, and Adad, i.e. the local storm god, being the source of the oracle and its mythic allusion in Marie, it is perhaps significant that one of Baal's epithets at Ugarit is like Urdm in a number of passages. This may be construed in two ways, as mightiest of heroes or as mighty one of the acts. I am increasingly inclined to the latter interpretation in view of the comparative evidence noted here. The Marie text also indicates that the significance of the myth presupposed a kind of identification of the king with the god. As the god was victorious in the great act of bringing order to the world by victory over the forces of chaos, so would the king continue to do in his historical military campaigns. A final aspect of royal ideology, so far as the king was concerned, which is of some interest, concerns the nature of royal burials. The ritual material will be noted below. Here I want to draw attention to some comparative evidence, where the Ugaritic and biblical materials provide reciprocal elucidation. This is a text dealing with royal mortuary rites performed in the month of Garnu, YRHGN. The term Gn means garden. A short section deals with the 8th day. To be offered, on the 8th day of the month, Garnu, Alu, Ing and 14 ewes, and 7 heifers, and an entire fish stew in the garden. And a response is given in the garden. 48 Then the king shall be desacralized. 49. The garden was evidently a part of the palace complex of buildings and lands in the western zone of the city, and constituted the royal cemetery. The recipients of the sacrifices listed here were the Thonian gods of the rest of the text, among whose number were the Enilm, the divine people, that is, the deceased kings. These were now among the underworld gods, buried in the cemetery, and themselves recipients of sacrifices and available for consultation through necromantic rites. The sacrifices appear to have been part of a process of inquiry, to judge from the phrase "and a response is given," which suggests some divine sign that the offerings are acceptable, or perhaps a response to some question put to the gods, or more likely the Enilm as ancestors. In the Pantheon list discussed above, set 7, it will be recalled, begins with MLKM, kings. This is another collective term for deceased kings who are now divine. 50 The expression garden as the burial place of the kings of Ugarit suggests two intriguing connections. First, within Ugaritian tradition there is a passage in the Baal myth where the god, now dead, and presumably ready to be buried, is sought in a remote place by Anot's messengers. They tell her that we traveled to the ends of the earth, to the edge of the abyss. We came to paradise, the land of pasture. To delight, the steppe by the shore of death. We came upon Baal fallen to the earth. 51. And she subsequently goes to fetch his body for burial. The place described is at the end of the world, a place of intersection of the world above and the world below. 52 Second, the kings of Judah were routinely buried in the king's garden, Gan Hamelech, where the expression denotes a specific area within the palace complex, and may allude not to living kings, but to dead ones, perhaps seen collectively as Melech, subsequently often distorted to Molech. Not only is this place to be identified in tradition with the Garden of Eden of Genesis 2-3, where post-biblical tradition has the antediluvian patriarchs buried, but Jesus is buried there in the Yohan 9 tradition. This appears to be cognate with Ugaritian tradition. The royal ideology also concerned the person of the queen. No queen of Ugarit is so designated, but the Dowager Queen of Amuru, whose daughter, the Queen of Ugarit, was the subject of vicious divorce proceedings, was consistently referred to in the correspondence as Rabatu. We have seen this as an epithet, great lady, used of the sun goddesses Athirat and Shapsh. It appears that the queen was seen as mystically identified with the sun goddess in giving birth to the king. We have noted, see further below, that the gracious gods. Text gives the mythic account of the birth of the royal gods Shahar and Shalom to El and Shapsh. This text constitutes a sacred marriage tradition in the sense that it appears to give a theological version of the actual marriage and reproduction of the royal couple. A further allusion to a sacred marriage, this time apparently between the king and the goddess Pidre, daughter-wife of Baal in theological terms, may be present in the opening lines of the following text. On the 19th day the bed of Pidre is made ready for the installation of the king. 53. This appears to link the king ideologically with Baal, a feature already noted in this discussion. This text has been interpreted as part of the enthronement rites for a new king, but this remains uncertain. Myths and other ideological literature. We have noted a number of mythological texts, and compositions of similar kind, in discussing the deities. The material thus far discovered can represent only a fraction of the mythic traditions of an ancient community, and presumably many of the gods listed above who have no apparent myths lack them only because of the hazards of survival or non-survival of records. The overwhelming bulk of religious tradition from the following millennium in the Levant is entirely absent, owing at least in part to the abandonment of clay tablets written in cuneiform in favor of parchment, papyrus and other less durable media for writing. All that remain are a few monuments in stone, and allusions in classical authors. Baal myths. 7 tablets 54 appear to preserve a string of narratives concerning the god Baal, which for all the gaps, about 50%, allow a tentative sequence as follows. El, as lord of the Pantheon, enthrones Yam as king among the gods. Baal is bound and placed under his throne. Kotha hands him weapons, with which Baal kills Yam, and takes his place. Baal then goes to Anat and the two set about obtaining El's permission to build Baal a palace. 55 When this is finally achieved, Baal holds a great inaugural feast. He omits to invite Mot, who then invites Baal to dine with him, i.e. to be his meal, and Baal goes down into the underworld. After in turn is enthroned in Baal's stead, coming down to earth to rule. A restored Baal then fights Mot, and the inconclusive struggle is brought to an end in favor of Baal by Shapsh, the narrative concluding with a hymn in her honor. The meanings of this mythic series have been much debated. By and large, interpretations fall into 2 types, the fertility cult or seasonal interpretation, and all the others, which vary between historical accounts to various forms of political theology. The former approach was immediately offered by the first interpreters, in accordance with the climate in early 20th century scholarship, culminating in the systematic treatment of Demore, 56, in which the author attempted to correlate the mythic episodes with ritual practice throughout the agroclimatic year. The other approaches see the cult of Baal and the etiology of his temple foundation as the chief theme. I have proposed that one of the reasons for Ilimilku's editing of this traditional material was to offer a legitimization of Nikmadu III, or perhaps to celebrate his marriage to a Hittite princess. More fundamentally, the conflict myth of Baal versus Yam falls into an ancient pattern, probably of Amorite origin if not even older, attested over a millennium previously in Eshnunna, near Babylon, with Babylonian, Assyrian, Marian, Hittite, Ugaritic and biblical versions, in addition to Greek, Iranian and Indian offshoots. All these versions sanctify the conduct of war as the reenactment of the primordial divine conflict. The recently discovered text from Murray cited above involves a ritual in which the weapons given to the king are explicitly identified as those used for divine victory in the myth. Thus one of the implications of other allusions to and tellings of the myth, its appropriation by various monarchies, and its ritual dimension, is evidently the legitimization of military activity. Theogony myths. 2 texts from Ugarit, on the surface very different, contain versions of a theogonic tradition, in which Il fathers twin sons on his wife, who is geminated for the occasion. In one, the Devourers, which harnesses the myth to a redemptive ritual and in which the offspring are devouring monsters, El's wives, who are also his daughters, are called respectively Tailish handmaid of Yari, thus hinting at El's lunar origins, and Dimgay handmaid of Athirat. In the other, the Gracious Gods, in which the offspring are Shahar and Shalom, the morning and evening stars, it is Shapsh, the sun goddess, geminated into the forms of Athirat and Rame, who not only are El's daughters, now his wives, but who also address him as mother, thus attesting his androgynous nature. As a number of scholars have argued, These myths have close biblical analogues, and their explicitly royal nature is apparent, as myths of the divine conception of the king. 57. This is not immediately apparent from the Ugaritic texts, but the latter is an interesting combination of mythical and ritual elements, which is located in the palace, in the presence of the king and queen, and thus fairly transparently points to royal births as bringing hope and salvation to the nation. Dealing with sun, moon and stars, it is also the subject of recent inquiry into astral aspects of Ugaritian religion. While there is nothing like the amount of information available from Mesopotamia, we read in various texts that the gods of Ugarit were stars, and we have seen the significance of the sun and moon. Here is an important dimension awaiting further research. Keret. The two extended stories in verse from Ugarit, in addition to the bull myths, associated with the poet Ilimilku are intrinsically interesting as ancient literature, but also betray strong ideological elements, as we might expect with an author working in the service of a king. The Keret story shows evidence of a reworked folktale, in which a king who has lost a wife and 7 children, or according to others, 7 wives, is instructed by El, the patron of kings, as noted above, to wage war on Pabul, king of Udum, demanding his daughter Huri in marriage. She will be blessed, and will bear 14 children to Keret, and even the youngest will be equally blessed as the firstborn. All goes according to plan, except that on the way to Udum, Keret makes a vow to Athirat, goddess of Tyre, which he then fails to fulfill. The angry goddess makes him ill. As he lies dying, El fails to persuade other gods of the council to heal the king, and finally himself creates a healing goddess who restores Keret. Meanwhile, however, the king's impetuous son bursts in and demands that his father, unable to fulfill the duties of a king, abdicate in his favor. Keret curses him. Since this curse presumably, just as a blessing would, redounds down to the youngest daughter, Keret is back where he began. The wheel of fortune has turned full circle. From a religious perspective, the story is full of interest. It illustrates a number of important theological points. It shows the close relationship, of father and son, noted above, between El and the king. It shows the unquestioning obedience required of one under divine instruction. No room here for reflection, or the weighing of pros and cons. When Keret has entered into the second relationship, as a votary of Athirat, already a sin, since it interrupts his duty to El, it shows the terrible danger of treating such a serious undertaking lightly. In contrast to the practical benefits of a blessing in ancient thought, it shows the terrible power of a curse. Finally, it illustrates the intriguing theological tension in a pantheon, when different divine powers work against each other. Akhat. While the storyline of Akhat is on the surface entirely different, it explores some of the same issues as Keret. Danul is a king without a son. With a tablet probably lost before the surviving opening of the narrative, we can only speculate on whether any previous children had died. He spends a week in ritual activity in a shrine, and at the end of it we see the gods deliberating in council. Baal asks El to see to Danul's problem, granting him a son who will perform all the appropriate ritual and social duties a son performs for his father. Akhat is born, and Kotha appears with a composite bow fit for a hero. The goddess Anat no sooner sets eyes on the bow than she determines to have it. Her powers of persuasion do not work with the rather gauche young Akhat. Even an offer of eternal life merely draws a sarcastic response. At this point she goes to El and demands vengeance. El gives her a free hand. With a mercenary assistant Yartipan, she plots Akhat's death. They will both hover among a flock of falcons over Akhat, and Yartipan will swoop down and kill Akhat with a blow. Thus it happens, and Anat immediately mingles a savage revenge on Akhat's corpse with a maudlin complaint that she did not even get the bow. Akhat's remains are devoured by the mother falcon. Eventually the bleak news is brought to Danul, who retrieves his son's remains and buries them, and goes into mourning for 7 years. His daughter Pughat, more practically, seeks vengeance, and the last tablet unfortunately breaks off with her, disguised perhaps as Anat, plying an already somewhat befuddled Yartipan with strong drink. What theological points does this narrative offer? The list of filial duties is recognized as offering an important insight into the routine performance of private religion. Daniel is to be blessed, so that he may beget a son in his house, a scion in the midst of his palace. He shall set up the stela of his ancestral God, in the sanctuary the cypress of his kinsman, into the earth sending forth his dying breath, into the dust protecting his progress. He shall shut the mouths of his slanderers. He shall drive away those who are ill-disposed towards him, taking his hand when he is drunk, supporting him when sated with wine. He shall serve up his share in the house of Baal, and his portion in the house of El. He shall plaster his roof on a muddy day. He shall wash his clothes on a filthy day. 58. Here we see the paramount importance of a firstborn son in the performance of his father's funeral obsequies. But his duties included general protection of his father's honor and person, practical support in delicate moments, participation in family ritual duties, and basic house repairs and domestic chores. The text has all the hallmarks of a traditional summary of the demands of filial piety. Perhaps the most contentious issue in Akat is the role of Anat and the theological assessment of her nature. She has been described as a spoilt adolescent and as illustrating the moral bankruptcy of a debased religion. Charges of immorality have also been leveled against El and other members of the Pantheon, which de Moore has called the Pantheon of Disillusion, on account of this apparent laissez-faire theology. Such judgments miss the point, as noted above, failing to recognize the symbolic nature of the gods, and their role in representing issues of human freedom and responsibility. Polytheism works on a pragmatic basis, balancing human aspirations and ideals against the harsh realities of life, where life expectancy was probably around 30, and from childbirth on one survived, or failed to survive, drought and famine, disease and poverty, tyranny and war, in equal measure, though these curses of human life were also balanced by blessings of peace and plenty, rich agriculture and productive family life. Theology's task, then as now, was to offer a rationale to this pitiless assault and its puzzling contrast with the happier aspects of life, and to balance these external forces with human aspirations and values. Polytheism's answer was to deify every aspect of human experience. Anat, the nubile maiden who is a quite unpredictable mixture of ruthlessness and tenderness, lust and hate, embodied to a powerful degree the exigencies of war, its strange combination of the love of comrades and the savagery of the battlefield. No wishful thinking here. But each deity contributed to an overall divine economy. From the full perspective of the Pantheon, Anat and the horrors she represented were tempered with the lust for life of her brother Baal, lord of Ugarit, and the benign oversight of Father El, who sat immovably at the center of all things. Shorter compositions. Some shorter compositions have already been noted above. Others of interest and the subject of detailed study are the following. 3 tablets known as the Arpam texts 59 narrate the coming of the Arpam on horse-drawn chariots to a feast. We have noted the connection of the Arpam with deified kings, and the existence of a patron or collective figure called Rapio, Rapu. The present texts are perhaps mythic or even hymnic fragments accompanying royal funeral or kispam rites. The poem of Nitkal tells the myth of the courtship and marriage of Nitkal, a Hurrian derivative of the Sumerian goddess Nin.gal, and Yari, though his name probably translates Ku, the Hurrian moon god. After the ceremonies, the tablet concludes with a hymn to the Kotharat. The tablet may have constituted part of the liturgy for a wedding or for childbed rites. There is a fragment describing a goddess fighting a dragon, the sea, and binding it in the heights of the Lebanon. This echoes an episode in the Baal myth in which Anat claims to have killed various monsters, as well as the Egyptian myth of Astarte and the sea, but the present goddess is not identified. This may perhaps be a myth of the origin of the constellation Draco. We have a hymn to Baal, describing him reclining on his mountain. It is an interesting amalgam of transcendent and immanent deity, the mountain half compared with, almost half identified with the god. His head is magnificent. His brow is dew-drenched. His feet are eloquent in his wrath. His horn is exalted. His head is in the snows in heaven. With the God there is abounding water. His mouth is like two clouds. His lips, like wine from jars. His heart, 60. Evidence of this kind is frequently cited as indicating Baal's role as a fertility god. He certainly is in control of environmental and climatic conditions, but the imagery here serves rather as a metaphor for divine majesty and transcendence. The mountain on which the deity reclines is his throne, the Omphalos, Mount Saphan. The obverse of one tablet is a typical ritual text, giving part of a cultic calendar involving the king's duties. On the reverse is a hymn to Baal as protector of the city in time of war. It is in the typical form of a vow, stating what is required of the deity in the form of a condition, followed by what is offered in response. If you will drive the strong one from our gate, the warrior from our walls, a bull, O Baal, we shall dedicate. A vow, Baal, we shall fulfill. A male animal, Baal, we shall dedicate. A propitiation we shall fulfill. A feast, Baal, we shall prepare. We shall go up to the sanctuary of Baal. We shall walk in the paths of the temple of Baal. 61. The word translated here as a male animal, reading *DKR, is damaged, and has alternatively, but less plausibly, been read as *BKR, firstborn, which would be the only clear evidence so far for human sacrifice in Ugarishan religion. 62. One of the ivory bed panels suggests the ritual killing of captured kings, see Fig. 3.4, while KTU 1.325-30, quoted in part above, contains a double battle scene in which Anat slaughters her victims. The second episode has been interpreted as the ritual aftermath of war. But whether these reflect actual religious practice or mythological figures remains uncertain. Where human sacrifice is clearly attested, as in Israel and Moab, it is a last resort in times of personal or national crisis. More commonly, as in the translation above, votive gifts in response to a divine favor are usually forms of animal sacrifice, or the dedication of stelae, statues, precious metals or, at Ugarit, ship's anchors, appropriate to a maritime culture. Ritual. A considerable variety of ritual texts has been discovered, mostly in Ugaritic, with a few in Horan. Del Olmo's Study 63 provides a typology for the texts. He distinguishes between records, prescriptive rituals and recited rituals. The distinction is important in terms of understanding the amount of information that is to be gleaned from texts that are often succinct to the point of obscurity. The ritual texts merely list victims and other offerings, giving details of time and place. No theory of sacrifice may be discerned, and the actual richness of the cult, with hymns, the playing of instruments and ritual dancing must be left to the imagination. A pale echo may be discerned in the following passage, which addresses Rapio, whom men hymn and honor with music. On the lyre and the flute. On drum and cymbals. With castanets of ivory. Among the goodly companions of Kotha. 64. No calendar or list of months has survived from Ugarit. But the month names are known, and their order apart from two, and it is evident from surviving texts that it was normal to have monthly ritual programs. These survive in the following instances, first of the wine Yaru and garden. The latter 2 months appeared to have placed considerable emphasis on rituals involving the royal dead. Religion and economic life. This is an area in which research has barely begun, and which will repay further study. The temple cults of ancient cities must have had a considerable economic impact, which is best documented in Egypt, with extensive accounts of taxation levied on the temple's behalf and extensive storage and warehouse facilities. With their fairly substantial personnel, their evident involvement in government, and consequent landholdings and agricultural activities, the priesthood obviously had a vested interest in a system in which commodities, livestock, cereals, oil, wine, precious metals, woven products and so forth, were circulated through the economy by means of the cultic process. The number of animals offered in a single day would vary with the importance of the ritual context. But days of significance, generally quarter days, with an emphasis on new and full moons, and the periodic festivals, no doubt related to the mythic traditions of individual deities, though no specific information on this count is so far available, would undoubtedly have larger numbers of victims. The following figures are taken from a selection of tablets. 1. The Day of Atonement, KTU 1.40. The text is seriously damaged, though its original form can be largely reconstructed, because of its repetitive character. It identifies only 6 victims, 2 bulls, 2 rams and 2 donkeys. But these are the most significant, and form a series of climaxes to each successive stage. We may suppose a number of preparatory offerings before the final stages. 2. The rituals of the month of First of the Wine, on day 14, 14 rams, 13 ewes, 1 lamb, 1 bull, 12 heifers, 8 birds, unspecified, 1 pigeon, but how many times, in addition, 7 unidentified items, damaged text, perhaps further animals, a jar, 30 chalices and cups, or their contents, a libation, 14 pitchers of wine, myrrh oil, spiced oil, probably olive oil, honey and flour. 3. Unspecified palace rituals. Text KTU 1.43 is substantially damaged, but 2 sections allow a fairly continuous reading. When Aftat of the window enters the pit in the royal palace, pour a libation into the pit of the chapel of the star gods. Offerings: a robe and a tunic, a ewe garment, gold, 3 shekels according to the commercial weight, a ram, an ox and 3 sheep as communion sacrifices, 7 times to the gods, and 7 times to Kotha. Subsequently the 2 Gathru gods come into the royal chapel. A shekel of gold to Shapsh and Yari, to Gathru a shekel of refined silver, a muzzle and a lun, G, to Anot, a shekel of gold to Shap, Sh and Yari, to Gathru 2 shekels of refined silver, a muzzle and a lung, to Anot, temple, an ox and a ram. If we quantify the items mentioned here, they amount to a libation, a robe, a tunic, an upgarment, 5 shekels of gold, 3 shekels of silver, 14 bulls, 14 rams, 4 to 2 sheep, ewes, 2 muzzles and 2 lungs, or pair of lungs, presumably from one of the victims listed. 4. The royal funerary cult in the month Yaru. There is some damage to one end, and so important dating aspects may be missing. But taking the requirements of day 18, on the reverse, as continuous with the text of the obverse, for the sake of argument, we have the following results: unspecified amounts of gold and silver, 15 rams, 4 to 1 ewes, 11 bulls, 3 birds and 1 lung, or pair. The origins of some victims, or their prior preparation, 1 white ewe, perfumed, OBV. 1.2, are mentioned. Since such texts are often damaged, and those found represent only a fraction of any complete record, it is not possible to build up an absolute figure for consumption, so these are merely random indications of the kind of turnover involved. In any case, each shrine would have its own regular cultic program, in addition to important and periodic state rituals. But the principles involved are apparent, and we may in any case add the votive stelae, the votive anchors, appropriate to a maritime city, temple timberwork and fabrics, general artistic input, and masonry, construction and repair work, to envisage a substantial body of staff directly or indirectly involved in running an urban temple complex. At times specific herds are mentioned as the source of individual victims. Ilimilku, the scribe of the literary texts, is identified at the end of the bull cycle of myths as diviner, chief of the priests, chief of the temple herdsmen. 65 This reference not only indicates the variety of responsibilities one official might have, and Ilimilku was also court poet and theologian, to judge from his compositions, but shows that ritual and managerial roles might be combined, and that temples had a direct involvement in the provision of their livestock requirements. No information is forthcoming from Ugarit, but the common practice of buying meat in urban markets which had come from temple slaughterhouses, which gave rise to problems for religious susceptibilities among Jews and Christians, suggests that sacrifice could also be viewed as part of the production system for food for the population. This was certainly a likely system, as otherwise the figures cited above could be viewed as a flagrant waste of resources. It is likely that part of the rationale of sacrifice was an incorporation of the gods into the human food supply system, offering them commensality, so that their continued acceptance of offerings was construed as an endorsement of the ritual-industrial complex. Again, there is no evidence for financial management from Ugarit, but biblical passages such as 1 Kings 14:25-26, 15:16-19, 2 Kings 12:18-19, 14:8, 14 etc. indicate that the throughput of gold and silver bullion effectively made of temples the banks of the ancient world. Deposits were laid in trust with the gods in the form of votive offerings and regular ritualized contributions to the treasury, as in the texts cited above, to be drawn on in time of economic need. The use of such resources by enemy kings was an early form of bank robbery. More seriously, the taking of booty in turn freed up such resources by bringing them back into circulation. This form of analysis is not intended to be reductionistic. It is important to recognize just how pervasive religion was in the ancient world, so that many categories of social structure and function now treated as economic in nature formed part of the religious praxis of antiquity. Omens and oracles. An important aspect of religion is the way in which it deals with the problem of the human experience of time. As a species, we are probably uniquely aware of time, its flow, the notions of past and future, and our inevitable mortality. An interesting starting point for this discussion is the issue of orientation. In all cultures, we may speak of a canonical orientation, meaning the position adopted in relation to the cardinal points. In all Semitic cultures, as in many others, the primary orientation was, as the term orientation suggests, towards the east. The vocabulary used for the cardinal points, QDM, east, west, small, north, YMN, south in Ugaritic, also serve to denote the flow of time, QDM, past, future, and the moral dimension associated with handedness, small, left hand, and ideas of moral doubt and the sinister, YMN, right hand, and ideas of the auspicious and the good, point 66. What this evidence indicates is that people looked into the past, with the future an unknown quantity behind them. The past provided the paradigms for religious and social behavior, myth and tradition alike were given, and one observed and honored patterns established in tradition, by the gods and the ancestors. At the same time, the future remained a concern. If the gods and the ancestors had provided guidance for the present, they must have also provided for future contingencies. This logic invited the scrutiny of ritual contexts to see what clues had been provided. The most elaborate form was in the examination of sacrificial material. The internal organs, amenta, of animals provided the omens of the future. Ugaritian practice here was evidently in the Mesopotamian tradition. A number of clay model livers have been found at Ugarit, together with one instance of a lung. The priests butchering sacrificial victims would note odd features, inflamed lobes, prominent blood vessels, and so forth, on the surface of the organ. The actual coincident occasion of royal deaths, battles, storms, famines, and other such crises, were linked in their minds with these features, and a literature grew up in which such signs were taken as divine warnings of future events. What sounds at first an entirely irrational procedure was in fact entirely rational, since the warnings could be used for evasive action. The crucial thing, in terms of religious psychology, was that it gave a sense of control over events, rather than being merely at the mercy of events. The contexts of the interpretations of these model organs remain opaque. Inscriptions 8 to 10 on the model lung involve goats, appear to belong together, and read as follows. A woman they shall take a goat. If the city is captured, then death, MT, or the man, i.e. the enemy king, will attack the population. In the temple a citizen shall take a goat and, the future, will be seen from afar. These may be early examples of the substitutionary atonement ritual attested in Israel in Leviticus 16, the Day of Atonement scapegoat ritual. A similar early version has been found at Ebla, in central Syria, and Hittite practice is analogous. If the connections are established, the wide incidence of the ritual points to considerable antiquity behind the theory. The present example suggests a general strategy that might be employed to deal with any unknown future contingency. Birth deformities in animals or children were also seen as signs for the future. 2 tablets deal with animals, while another, in a fragmentary state, covers human malformations. Natural portents, such as lunar, stellar and solar eclipses and the like, the perceived influence of the evil eye and without doubt many other natural occurrences, to judge from Mesopotamian parallels, 67 were all treated with extreme circumspection. Personal religion. Since Ugarit was a royal city, and most of its archives come from palaces, temples or the houses of priestly or administrative people, we have little direct insight into personal piety, and the everyday religious practice of ordinary people. We catch glimpses, as in the list of filial duties in Akhat, and the evidently representative nature of some texts, where perhaps a congregation joined in the singing of hymns or was present at some of the main rites such as the Day of Atonement. A number of kinds of material provide further information of a minimal kind. Thus personal names, as usually in the ancient world, were commonly of theophoric construction, that is, containing a divine name attached to a verbal or epithetal element. Thus Abrp, Rapu, means Reshef is my father, while Blytn. Balyutana, means Baal has given, me him her. While these would tend to run in families, they originated in personal experiences, particularly childbirth, and tend to reflect instinctive reactions to a safe birth. Some private correspondence survives, and though most of this is between officials, or to or from members of the royal family, it still betrays common religious clichés. A common formula is YLMLKM ilm TGRM TLMKM, or some variation, may it be well with you, the gods give you good health. A similar expression occurs typically in a letter written in Akkadian by a bugama to the intendant of Amuru. Greetings to you. May the gods of Amuru, the gods of Ugarit and the gods of the king your lord keep you well. Various artifacts of a religious kind survive, from large stelae portraying deities, probably votive gifts to temples, to small amulet plaques representing goddesses, perhaps worn as charms round the neck, and cylinder seals, found in their thousands throughout the ancient Near East, which frequently illustrate some mythical or ritual scene, and were worn as amulets as well as marks of identity. Sickness and health. A number of texts from Ugarit deal with medical conditions. We have noted text KTU 1.114, L in his Marzi. U, as a cure for hangover, and the Nitkal text as relating to weddings, or childbirth with its attendant dangers. One tablet contains a spell for curing the effects of snakebite, in which 11 different deities are invoked in vain, a 12th, Horan, an underworld god, being able to effect a cure by means of the application of tamarisk, no doubt as the paradigm of what healers did to the accompanying recitation of the text. There are 2 further snakebite texts, indicating that here was a common contingency dealt with by ritual medical means. Incantations used for exorcism have also been found. One treats a possessed adolescent, or, in the view of some, a case of impotence. Another appears to deal with a pediatric complaint. Death, funerals and kispim, equals pogru, rites. We have already touched on aspects of this in discussing royal ideology above. Evidence for belief and practice concerning death in other parts of Ugarishan society is found in the numerous family vaults located under the floors of most houses, as well as those in the palaces, at Ugarit, Mahadu and Ras Ibn Hani. Of corbelled construction with dressed stones, the burial chamber, sometimes in the form of a simple oblong chamber but sometimes with secondary chambers, was reached by a stair descending from ground floor level. A certain amount of funerary deposits, pots, jewelry and so forth, were found, though these gave no indication of beliefs among ordinary people. The episode in the Akhat story during which Anot negotiates for the bow is instructive. Here is her final offer and the hero's response. Ask for life, O hero Akhat. Ask for life and I shall give it, you. Immortality and I shall bestow it on you. I shall make you number your years with Baal. With the son of El you shall number months. Like Baal he shall live indeed. Alive, he shall be feasted. He shall be feasted and given to drink. The minstrel shall intone and sing concerning him. And she said to him, Thus shall I make Akhat the hero live. But Akhat the hero replied, Do not deceive me, O virgin. For to a hero your deceit is rubbish. Man, at his end, what will he receive? What will he receive, a man, as his destiny? Silver will be poured on his head, gold on top of his skull. And, the death of all I shall die. And I shall surely die. The contrast with the Gilgamesh epic is interesting. There it is the hero who aspires to immortality, while the goddess Sidui counsels acceptance of a more limited destiny. Here it is the goddess who offers a life like that of a god, while Akhat rejects this as preposterous. Tradition teaches him something altogether more down to earth. It is perhaps significant that Ilimilku can conceptualize eternal life. Here is the germ of a new dimension of human experience. But Akhat, though a prince who might look forward in due course to the divine status of a former king, and membership of the MLKM and Enilm, if not the Arpum, accepts only a minimalist interpretation of human destiny. The allusion to silver and gold, if this is the meaning of an obscure crux, is probably to death masks of the early Greek pattern. It is possible that the text reflects a new development in Ugaritian beliefs, since Baal is significantly used as the object of comparison. Where his mortality, and subsequent restoration to life, is used for a comparison in the Keret story, it is with a view to validating royal ideology, as noted above. So the same form of argument may be in evidence here. As this text suggests, there appears to have been a wide incidence of speculation throughout the ancient world about various possibilities of a post-mortem existence. As to ritual practice with regard to funerals, we have several pieces of evidence, beginning with the funeral text cited above, all of a royal nature. This is the liturgy for the funeral of Nikmadu III, penultimate king of Ugarit. A number of dead kings, including the legendary Arpum, see above, are summoned to attend, and are presumably understood to gather in the tomb entrance, where they will form a ghostly guard of honor to the dead king as he is lowered into his vault, and thus goes down into the underworld. The goddess Shapsh is invoked, apparently in her underworld role of guide of the dead, and then Nikmadu himself is directed to go down to his ancestors. 7 offerings are made on his behalf, and a blessing is pronounced on his successor King Amurapi and on the city. The text appears to be the actual liturgy, but may be merely an outline. Other elements, such as Kispim, rites for the dead kings, being understood to form the first part of the proceedings. It is impossible on present evidence to determine how far this may represent more general conceptions about the destiny of commoners. Other texts, however, are associated with aspects of communication with the underworld, and with communication with the dead, as in the Kispim rites noted above. Thus one text invokes Horan deities at a royal funeral, while others also relate to royal funerals, and the Arpum texts undoubtedly constitute some mythic or even hymnic aspect of the Kispim rites above. There was thus a considerable emphasis on the continuing importance of kings after their death, as they remained potent for the continued welfare of the living. Whether the elaborate domestic arrangements for the interment of the dead within the home are to be construed as pointing to similar family cults, possibly centering on the collective figure the god of the ancestor, the first member of the canonical Pantheon list, remains unknown, and we have already noted ambiguities concerning beliefs. We also have a number of passages which describe mourning. 2 mythological passages narrate the reaction of El and Anot respectively on hearing the news of Baal's death. The first reads as follows. Then the wise, the perceptive god, went down from his throne. He sat on his footstool. And from his footstool, he sat on the ground. He poured the ashes of affliction on his head, the dust of groveling on his skull. For clothing he put on a loincloth. His skin with a stone he scored. His side locks with a razor. He gashed cheeks and chin. He ploughed his collarbones. He turned over like a garden his chest. Like a valley he ploughed his breast. He lifted up his voice and cried, Baal is dead. What has become of the powerful one? The son of Dagon. What has become of Tempest? After Baal I shall go down into the underworld. 68. It is striking to find this human response attributed to the head of the Pantheon. What is here presented as a potential cosmic dissolution perfectly reflects the emotional despair felt by mourners, but at the same time the acceptance as significant for the mourner of the fate of the dead. It also provides a paradigm for the human ritual response to death. A ritual self-abasement is followed by a self-burial rite, the putting on of a mourning garment, a symbolic shroud, with self-laceration and the cutting of the hair. The fact that such practices were forbidden in biblical law, e.g. Leviticus 19:27-28, is an indication of their pervasive use. Elaborate mourning for Keret is envisaged in the Keret narrative, probably, even allowing for some literary hyperbole, reflecting actual practice. Like dogs shall we howl at your tomb. Like whelps at the entrance to your burial chamber? Yet, Father, how can you possibly die? Or will your burial chamber be given over to howling? On the part of women, O my wretched father. 69. Similarly, wailing women and self-lacerating men spend 7 years mourning Akhat. Mythic account and ritual practice are designed intuitively to give form as well as expression to grief, thus affecting the acceptance and healing process. Iconography. Seals. Mention has been made of cylinder seals, small amulets, stelae and so forth. The former categories, while obviously produced in workshops according to accepted stylistic and iconographic canons, represent more popular forms, as being cheaper to produce. They are very diverse in type. The seals cover a huge range of designs, of many variations on traditional themes, so that they borrow many foreign forms, just as distinctive Syrian forms themselves become popular elsewhere. The latter group are more significant, and a fine example is the motif of the weather god on 2 mountains, showing an deity, accompanied by various animal forms, striding along with each foot on an adjacent mountain peak. Examples of this have been found from Egypt to Anatolia from the 18th century onwards. The mountains in question are probably to be identified as the twin peaks of Jebel el-Akra, Mount Saphan, known in Latin as Cassius and Anticassius. Stelae. The most imposing of these is undoubtedly the so-called Baal au Foudre Stela, discovered in 1932, Fig. 3.1. The upper pair of wavy lines has been interpreted as representing the body of the serpentine yam, on whom the victorious bull strides in triumph. This is analogous to the 2 mountains of the cylinder seals, since the mountain is undoubtedly identified with the cadaver of the sea god. Figure 3.1. The Baal au Foudre Stela from Ugarit. The style illustrates the importance of Egyptian influence in Syrian art of the Middle and Late Bronze Age. Wearing the Egyptian kilt, the god strides forward, wielding a fenestrate axe in his right hand, and a cedar trunk which ends as a spear in the left. The diminutive figure in front of the god is the king, enrobed in a ritual garment as often portrayed in iconography, and probably described in the opening lines of Akhat. Figurines. Small figurines in clay or bronze have been found in a number of Levantine sites, conforming to widely attested patterns. From Ugarit come a number of small gold amulets in the form of plaques up to about 10 centimeters in length, showing a female figure, with pronounced pubic triangle. These are usually supposed to relate to the fertility cult, and may have symbolized nubility and fecundity for young women, or were invoked to gain the maternal, protective attention of the goddess. Bronze figures of deities may have been in use as devotional images in domestic contexts. More substantial, though still surprisingly small, are cult images. A gilded bronze of a bearded male figure wearing the Egyptian Atef crown is usually identified as El. The same iconography occurs on a small stela showing El enthroned and blessing the king beneath the winged disk of the sun goddess, while in the building immediately north of the Riten temple was found a small stone figure of El on a throne, Fig. 3.2. This was probably the cult image, housed in the shrine. Sockets allowed the addition of arms, perhaps held in gestures of power or benevolence, or holding symbols, thus the stela just noted has El holding up one hand in blessing, while the other holds the ritual cup of blessing. An Atef crown, derived from Egyptian art where it was worn by Osiris, was probably placed on it during the cult. Ivories. A number of items in ivory have been found in Ugarit. The most significant are undoubtedly the series of panels forming a bedhead, perhaps belonging to the king, or even used for the sacred marriage. 12 panels were surrounded by a frieze of plants and moving animals. The panels themselves seem to be devoted primarily to royal ideological motifs. Royal figures are shown in various hunting, military or cultic contexts. The motif of the dual nature of the king is represented by a winged and robed goddess with cow's horns and sun disk, i.e. Shapsh, suckling two boys, Fig. 3.3. They stand fully clothed on either side, her arms protectively round their shoulders. A variation on the Egyptian smiting motif, Fig. 3.4, shows the king clutching a kneeling enemy and thrusting his eyes out with a sword. Ugarit and its legacy in the external world. As we noted at the beginning, aspects of religion often outlast a culture, living on among émigrés or through general cultural influence. The continuing influence. Figure 3.2. Stone statuette of El from Ugarit. Of Ugarit would certainly inform any discussion of Phoenician religion, that is the religion of the Levant in the 1st millennium BCE, though this is so poorly documented by direct sources throughout its history that Ugarit remains the primary source, though belonging strictly to its prehistory. In addition, its impact may be discerned in two areas in particular, Greece and Israel. Figure 3.3. Suckling goddess from the ivory bedhead from Ugarit. Greece. We have noted sporadic connections between Ugaritian thought and similar ideas in Greece. It is increasingly recognized that Greek religious thought and practice, and in particular its mythology, owes a profound debt to the ancient Near East at large. This is scarcely surprising, quite apart from early trading and Figure 3.4. Smiting panel from the ivory bedhead from Ugarit. Diplomatic links. Since Ionian Greek settlements were always directly open to influences from the Anatolian hinterland, and Hittite culture and its inheritors filtered a wide range of Near Eastern ideas. It is probably fair to say that when their prehistories are examined there are few Greek deities who can be described as exclusively Greek, or even exclusively Indo-European. Some Oriental dimension or quality is usually to be discerned. Generally studies have noted links over the wider ancient Near Eastern area, but Ugarit played its part in the mediation of ideas. We have noted a possible prototype of Apollo in the plague god Resheph, and of Perseus and Andromeda in Baal's fight with Yam, see note 19. The latter may also underlie Hesiod's myth of the conflict between Zeus and Typhon, to which name compare to Saphon. Akhat, killed on Anot's orders, has been seen as lying behind Ecteon, killed on those of Artemis, and Baal's consorts have been seen as underlying the Greek tradition of the three graces. The relationship of Israelite religion to the older world of Ugaritian thought has been much debated. Many scholars have been at pains to minimize the Israel. The relationship of Israelite religion to the older world of Ugaritian thought has been much debated. Many scholars have been at pains to minimize the connection, though this varies from claims of little debt at all to insistence that Israel wholeheartedly rejected all the pagan traditions whose antecedents we discern at Ugarit. The reality is infinitely more complex than this. To begin with, to understand Iron Age Israelite religion, it is not sufficient to read the Hebrew Bible. Biblical scholarship increasingly recognizes in the biblical texts, particularly the historical ones, 70 not simply an account of events in Palestine during the first millennium BCE, but a lively critique and revaluation of all its traditions. The new is highlighted and validated in contrast to and rejection of the old. Secondly, it is clear that whatever its own status as historiography, any text has a history, in that it originates in a historical context. Thus, in spite of all its own agendas, the Bible reflects all kinds of cultural and religious debts, and its own prehistory may be recovered by judicious analysis of the texts. We have noted above a number of similarities between Israelite thought, as reflected or criticized in the Bible, and Ugarishan thought and practice. These are so numerous that it is fair to conclude that the two cultures are intimately connected. We even noted that the geography of the traditions of Og king of Bashan occurs in identical wording in an Ugaritic text. Numerous obscurities in the biblical text make sense when viewed against external evidence from the Near Eastern world, and Ugarit is the primary source for such comparisons. Among all the recent publications which have followed up the various clues relating in particular to Bronze Age antecedents, and links with the Ugarishan evidence, often with surprisingly informative results for the real history of Israelite religious ideas, we may cite just one example, the dictionary edited by K. Van der Toorn and colleagues. 71. This offers a huge range of discussion and bibliographies on the numerous deities met within the Bible. These comprise, among many others, all the main figures of the Ugarishan Pantheon. There has been increasing interest in particular in the Ugarishan goddess Athirat, and her Israelite counterpart Asherah, subject of several recent studies noted above. It is now generally conceded that the Israelite goddess was the consort of Yahweh, and evolved into the later figure of wisdom. The royal significance of Athirat in Ugarit, as mother of the king, is paralleled in a similar ideology concerning the Israelite queen mother. While many of the biblical allusions to Canaanite religion are characterized by caricature and black propaganda, there is a real debt to it. That there is an element of continuity is an unavoidable conclusion to any comparative study. Israelite religion is, after all, from a phenomenological point of view, part of the Canaanite religion of the first millennium. Insofar as the biblical texts judged this religion and found it wanting, they may be deemed to corroborate this view. Notes 1. CPP 149-54. 2. For the most recent treatment see Yon 2006. 3. Anot, KTU 1.3217-18, L, KTU 1.119.14, Horan, KTU 1.124.6, if correct reading. KTU, Die Kiel-alphabetisch Text aus Ugarit, is the standard reference system for texts written in the Ugaritic language. A selection of the most important religious texts is available in translation, with commentary, in Wyatt 2002, to which references are made in this chapter. 4. That is, personal names which contain a divine name, a very common form in the ancient Near East. These are explained below, p. 143. 5. The references given in the body of this chapter to KTU text numbers, see Note 3, may be read in translation, with commentary, in Wyatt 2002. 6. This term is used to denote features of West Semitic language and culture, particularly as occurring in Mesopotamian contexts. The Amorites who appear in Mesopotamian documents were tent-dwelling pastoralists, and the first names in the Assyrian king list are those of kings who lived in tents. Amuru means west, country, and the city of Muri on the Euphrates west, city. The term Amorite occurs in the Bible, where it has become a reference to the pre-Israelite inhabitants of Palestine, though compared to Ezekiel 16:3-45. Amorite as a language was closely related to Ugaritic. 7. CPP 134-6. 8. It is worth noting that human sacrifice, of adults and children, is not attested at Ugarit, but appears to have been endemic in Israelite religion. 9. The Greek name of the twin-peaked mountain was Casion, its two peaks being distinguished in Hellenistic and Roman times by the dual Latin names Cassius and Anticassius. The element Casion looks suspiciously like a transcription into Greek of the West Semitic word for throne, Ug. Kosiu, Hebkis, Ks, a view supported by a late name for the latter peak Anticassius, Ugaritic Nanu, Thronos, which evidently translates the name. 10. J. Rogerson draws attention to the complex problems of biblical interpretation in his chapter below. My allusions to biblical tradition are made in full recognition of his discussion and the cautions it advises. It is important to distinguish the historical conditions of, say, the premonarchical period, which can be tentatively reconstructed by reading between the lines of the books of Judges and 1 Samuel, and taking full account of archaeological and other evidence, from the Bible's own account of this, which presents it as religious anarchy and a falling away from true Mosaic religion as a result of interaction with Canaanite religion. There is some serious mythologizing at work in such a presentation. 11. E.g. Nitkal, a Hurrianized form of the Sumerian goddess Nin.gal, Great Lady. 12. E.g. Kotha, a form of Ptah of Memphis. 13. Fewest Semitic deities Bull, identified with Egyptian Seth, Resheph, Aftat and Anot became prominent during the Egyptian Second Intermediate Period of Hyksos rule in Lower Egypt, and later in the 19th dynasty. Rameses II had a particular devotion to the goddess Anot. 14. This is one of the numbers of the gods cited in Yajnavalkya's account of the Vedic Pantheon from India, Budriyaka Upanishad 3.9.12. I suspect that a calendrical application, presumably based on the ritual division of the lunar month, may have applied here, as above. 15. The Akhat story, KTU 1.17-19. 16. KTU 1.325-16. This illustrates the general construction of Ugaritic poetry, which uses the principle of parallelism, stating ideas in successive cola in couplets, bicola, or other combinations. 17. The South Arabian god of the morning star is Ashtar. A cuneiform version of the later 22-letter South Arabian alphabet has been found in Ugarit. The extent to which the stars were worshipped at Ugarit remains unclear. See below, p. 133. 18. KTU 1.92. 19. This myth also bears a passing resemblance to that of Perseus and Andromeda, whose Semitic antecedents are generally recognized. 20. KTU 1.43:1-3. 21. KTU 1.10. 22. KTU 1.11, compared to 1.13:29-36. 23. KTU 1.12. 24. KTU 1.119. 25. KTU 1.3v30-4, 1.4443-6. 26. CPP 126-31. 27. KTU 1.3v6-7 etc. 28. See NEB translation of Hosea 8:6, for what sort of a god is this bull? Or better, for who is Bull-El? Bull-El was one of his titles at Ugarit. 29. KTU 1.24. 30. KTU 1.521-3. 31. KTU 1.152-26-8. 32. KTU 1.161, compared to Isaiah 14:9-21, which parodies the funeral of a Mesopotamian king, and is evidently familiar with the same theological tradition. 33. KTU 1.108.2-3. 34. On the patron gods, see Del Olmo 1999, 58-60, where he draws attention to small groups of gods appearing regularly in royal rituals. He distinguishes them as patron gods, underworld gods, dynastic gods, and a small group of the great gods. 35. This point is discussed further at pp 134-6. 36. KTU 1.41. 37. This may be compared with the biblical narrative in Numbers 13:17-24, where in the season for early grapes the Israelite scouts bring back a vine branch as a sign of the agricultural potential of the land. 38. Del Olmo 1999, 88-9. 39. The Kubadu rite, honoring, involved offering sacred weapons to the gods, symbolizing the divine victory at creation, which was recapitulated in the king's military victories. 40. Ahalbu, who apparently died without issue, was succeeded by his brother Nikmepa VI. 41. KTU 1.113. 42. This Akkadian term was the equivalent of Ugaritic PGR, Pagru, offerings to the dead recorded, for instance, on 2 funerary stelae from Ugarit. 43. KTU 1.161, a royal funeral liturgy. 44. This would have been Nikmadu 2, not 3, the subject of the present obsequies. The number of kings of this name remains a problem. 45. See their stories below, pp 133-6. 46. Zimralim's reign was brought to an end by King Hammurabi of Babylon. 47. KTU 1.65. 48. Text BGN, or from the garden, if this is to be construed as a reply from the underworld to an oracular inquiry. 49. KTU 1.106.18-23. 50. The Bible records both Milcom, Heb MLKM, as the national god of Ammon, and Molech, also referred to as Moloch, Heb MLK, as an underworld deity receiving human sacrifice. In both instances we may be dealing with a deliberately distorted account of kings, i.e. the dead kings of Ammon and Judah respectively, who are invoked with sacrifices for oracles. Compare to Saul's invocation through a medium of Samuel's ghost, Heb. Lim, God, in 1 Samuel 28. 51. KTU 1.563-9, Wyatt 2002, 126. 52. Baal's death and restoration are compared elliptically to a king's death and restoration in the Keret story, KTU 1.1632-4. This deliberate literary connection, by the same author, Ilamilku, reinforces the associations made here. 53. KTU 1.132.12. 54. KTU 1.1-6. KTU 1.2, as generally numbered, appears to be 2 separate tablets. 55. The same words in Ugaritic denote a palace or a temple. 56. Demoa 1971. 57. Biblical tales such as Genesis 16, Hagar and Ishmael, Genesis 19:30-8, Lot and his daughters and the birth of Ammon and Moab, as well as the various psalms noted above and a number of other passages. 58. KTU 1.17 I-25-33. 59. KTU 1.20-2. 60. KTU 1.101.59. 61. KTU 1.119.28-33. 62. Compare to notate above. 63. Del Olmo 1999, 17-19. 64. KTU 1.10835. 65. It is possible that these titles belong to Atanu, Ilamilku's teacher and mentor. The syntax of the text is uncertain. 66. The terms QDM and A are also refer to the body, face and back respectively. Thus it is the placing of the body in a specific direction that allows the extrapolation of the means of organization of space, time and the moral dimension. Similar extensions of body terms apply to the external world in Akkadian, Sumerian, Arabic, Hebrew and Sanskrit. 67. The best general treatment is Blacker and Lowy 1975. 68. KTU 1.5611-25. 69. KTU 1.16 I-2-5, 14-19. 70. I would not include the patriarchal narratives of Genesis, or for that matter any of the so-called historical material of the Pentateuch, as prima facie historical material. It is largely pure fiction, and reflects the mythic account of the origins of a religious community, the Jews, and a tendentious account of all the internecine conflicts which went into its making. Some scholars would tend to apply this principle to the entire corpus. The present consensus, if one dare talk of consensus in this area, outside conservative academic circles would tend nowadays to lower the dates of most biblical historiography to the 5th century BCE or later. The immediate historical context of the texts is therefore the post-exilic world, rather than the time of the monarchy itself. This is not to deny the survival of older traditions embedded in our sources. 71. Van der Toorn et al. 1995, 2nd ed. 1999. Bibliography. I have restricted entries here to useful bibliography for the lay reader in English. See also the bibliography in Watson and Wyatt 1999 for publications down to early 1999, and references to all monograph series, periodicals devoted to Ugaritian studies and other bibliographical resources. For entries on the various deities, including many references to Ugaritian material, see also D. N. Friedman, ed., Anchor Bible Dictionary. 6 volumes, New York, Doubleday, 1992, and K. Van der Toorn et al., eds., Dictionary of Deities and Demons in the Bible. Leiden, Brill, 1995, 2nd ed. 1999. Binger, T. 1997. Asherah, Goddesses in Ugarit, Israel and the Old Testament. Sheffield, Sheffield Academic Press. Blacker, C. and M. Lowy 1975. Ancient Cosmologies. London, Allen and Unwin. Brooke, G. J. A. H. W. Curtis, and J. F. Healy, eds. 1994. Ugarit and the Bible, Proceedings of the International Symposium on Ugarit and the Bible, Manchester, September 1992. Munster, Ugarit Verlag. Curtis, A. H. W. 1985. Ugarit, Ras Shamra. Cities of the Biblical World. Cambridge, Lutterworth. Day, J. 1985. God's Battle with the Dragon and the Sea, Echoes of a Canaanite Myth in the Old Testament. Cambridge, Cambridge University Press. Handy, L. K. 1994. Among the Host of Heaven, the Syro-Palestinian Pantheon as Bureaucracy. Winona Lake, Eisenbrauns. Corpel, M. C. A. 1990. A Rift in the Clouds, Ugaritic and Hebrew Descriptions of the Divine. Munster, Ugarit Verlag. Lewis, T. J. 1989. Cults of the Dead in Ancient Israel and Ugarit. Atlanta, Georgia, Scholars Press. DeMoore, J. circa 1971. The Seasonal Pattern in the Ugaritic Poem of Bielu according to the version of Ilimilku. Neukirchen Vluin, Neukirchener Verlag, Kevelaar, Butson and Berker. Del Ormo Leet, G. 1999. Canaanite Religion according to the Liturgical Texts of Ugarit. Bethesda, Maryland, CDL Press. Pardee, D. 2002. Ritual and Cult at Ugarit. Atlanta, Georgia, Society of Biblical Literature. Parker, S. born in 1997. Ugaritic Narrative Poetry. Atlanta, Georgia, Scholars Press. Penglace, circa 1994. Greek Myths and Mesopotamia, Parallels and Influence in the Homeric Hymns and Hesiod. London, Routledge. Smith, M.S. 2002. The Early History of God. Grand Rapids, Michigan, Eerdmans, Dearborn, M.I., Dove. 2001, The Origins of Biblical Monotheism, Israel's Polytheistic Background and the Ugaritic Texts. Oxford, Oxford University Press. Walls, N. 1992. The Goddess are not in Ugaritic myth. Atlanta, Georgia, Scholars Press. Watson, W. G. E. and N. Wyatt, eds. 1999. Handbook of Ugaritic Studies. Leiden, Brill. Wiggins, S. A. 1993. A Reassessment of Ashura. Kevelaar, Butzen and Berker, Nieuwkerkenvloeien, Nieuwkerken Verlag. Wyatt, N. 1996. Myths of Power, a study of royal myth and ideology in Ugaritic and biblical tradition. Munster, Ugarit Verlag. 2002, Religious Texts from Ugarit. London, Continuum, 2nd ed. Wyatt, N. W. G. E. Watson and J. B. Lloyd, eds. 1996. Ugarit, Religion and Culture, Proceedings of the International Colloquium on Ugarit, Religion and Culture, Edinburgh, July 1994. Munster, Ugarit Verlag. Jon, M. 2006. The Royal City of Ugarit on the Tell of Ras Shamra. Winona Lake, Eisenbrauns. Supplementary reading. Cornelius, I. 2004. The Many Faces of the Goddess, the Iconography of the Syro-Palestinian Goddesses Anot, Astarte, Kedushet and Asherah circa 1500 to 1000 BCE. Freiburg, Academic Press, Göttingen, Vandenhoek and Ruprecht. Filiu, L. 2003. The God Dagon in Bronze Age Syria. Leiden, Brill. Green, A. R. W. 2003. The Storm God in the Ancient Near East. Winona Lake, Indiana, Eisenbrauns. Watson, W. G. E. 2003. Daily Life in Ancient Ugarit, Syria, Inna E. Averbeck, M. W. Chavalas and D. B. Weisberg, eds. Life and Culture in the Ancient Near East. Bethesda, Maryland, CDL Press, pp 121-51. Wyatt, N. 2005a. Epic in Ugaritic Literature, in J. M. Foley, ed., A Companion to Ancient Epic. Oxford, Blackwell, pp 246-54. 2005b. The Mythic Mind, Essays on Cosmology in Ugaritic and Old Testament Literature. London, Equinox. 2005c. There's Such Divinity Doth Hedge a King, Selected Essays of Nicholas Wyatt on Royal Ideology in Ugaritic and Old Testament Literature. London, Ashgate.